The first contact protocols had been running for 11 years before anyone realized the Vethara weren't studying humanity's technology. They were studying its grief. Commander Yora Osei learned this on a Tuesday, which felt like the wrong kind of day for civilizational revelation. Tuesdays were for maintenance reports and cold coffee and the particular exhaustion that came from managing 400 humans aboard the ISV Meridian while it sat parked in geosynchronous orbit above a planet that looked almost exactly like Earth if you squinted and desperately wanted it to be. She had been reading a casualty report from the surface team, Dr. Fenwick, xenobotanist, caught in a spore storm she'd been warned about 3 times, when the Vethara requested an emergency session. Their ambassador, the one the crew called Stillwater because its actual designation required vocal anatomy humans didn't possess, arrived at the diplomatic bay without the usual ceremonial delay. It moved the way all Vethara moved, like smoke deciding to have opinions, its translucent body cycling through colors that the translation matrix rendered into emotional valence. Right now it was cycling amber to gray in a pattern the linguists had classified as urgent bewilderment. Yora set down her coffee. "You've lost another one," Stillwater said. The translation came through flat, the way all Vethara speech did, stripped of the harmonic layers that carried most of their meaning. The female scientist. The spore fields. Dr. Fenwick. Yes. Yora kept her voice level. "We're recovering her remains now." We watched. Stillwater's color shifted into something the Matrix flagged as unclassified. "We watch all of you. You understand this, it is part of the agreement." "It is." We watched the others learn of her death. The amber deepened. "Commander, we have studied 412 species across this arm of the galaxy. We have observed loss events in 307 of them. What your crew did after the announcement, we have no category for it." Yora studied the alien cycling colors for a long moment. Outside the viewport, the planet turned slowly, indifferent. "What did we do that confused you?" "They gathered," Stillwater said. "The ones who knew her, and the ones who did not. They gathered in a room with no strategic purpose and they made sounds. Wept. And then the one called Petrov, who had argued with Dr. Fenwick publicly only 9 days prior, sat beside her laboratory assistant and placed his hand on the smaller human's back. He held him there for 40 minutes. Doing nothing. Producing nothing. 40 minutes of biological resource expenditure with no survival benefit. Yora said nothing. Then they told stories about her, Stillwater continued. Inaccurate ones, we believe. Exaggerated. They described her as braver than our behavioral records suggest she was. Funnier. They laughed while crying, Commander. Simultaneously. Our emotional modeling has never, the colors spiked into white, which the Matrix flagged as system stress, we cannot model this. Grief in other species follows predictable patterns. Withdrawal. Aggression. Pair bonding for protection. Your species does something else entirely. We mourn, Yora said. What is the adaptive purpose? She thought about Petrov, who was 53 years old and had grown up in Novosibirsk and had called Fenwick a reckless idiot to her face at least a dozen times and who had apparently spent 40 minutes holding a 26-year-old kid together in a break room on a Tuesday. I'm not sure it has one, she said. Not in the way you mean. This was, as she would later understand, the answer that changed everything. The Vethara had been a spacefaring civilization for 60,000 years. This was not unusual among the species they'd encountered. The galaxy was old, and intelligence tended to find its feet eventually. What was unusual was their survival rate. Of the 412 species they'd catalogued, fewer than 30 had achieved stable interstellar civilization. The rest had collapsed, or stagnated, or simply stopped. Stillwater explained this to Yora over the following 6 days in a series of sessions that the diplomatic corps began calling, privately, the uncomfortable conversations. The Vethara had developed a predictive model over millennia of observation. It was, Stillwater explained, extremely accurate. When a species encounters loss at civilizational scale, the death of a leader, a failed colony, a war that costs more than it gains, there is a response curve. All species follow it. Grief becomes liability. The organism protects itself by limiting attachment. Calcifying. The ones who feel too much stop risking. The ones who risk too much stop feeling. Either path leads to the same end. The color cycled into something Yora had started reading as resigned certainty. We have watched it many times. It is not cruelty. It is mathematics. You predicted it would happen to us, Yora said. We have been predicting it for 40 years. Since your first probes. The signs are consistent. Stillwater paused. You lose people constantly. Your biology is fragile. Your environment's hostile. Your risk tolerance, frankly, Commander, your risk tolerance is alarming to observe. We expected your civilization to either calcify in response to accumulated grief, or to fragment. The modeling suggested fragmentation within 2 generations of interstellar contact. But Petrov held the young one for 40 minutes. Stillwater's colors did something Yora had never seen before, a rapid cycling that settled into a shade the matrix rendered, tentatively, as the feeling of a hypothesis failing. And then the young one, Vasquez, we believe, went back to Dr. Fenwick's laboratory and finished her work. The specimens she had collected. He catalogued them. He wept while doing it, quite a lot, and he finished. He labeled the final specimen with her name. The colors held steady. Commander. No other species does this. Yora felt something shift in her chest. Finishes the work of the dead. Carries them forward. Continues the task as though the lost one is still present. Relevant. As though death did not fully sever the connection. Stillwater moved toward the viewport, its form drifting in a way that might have been contemplative. We watched Vasquez work, and we ran the behavioral data through every model we have. The closest analog we found was a cooperative species from the Denhari cluster that maintains chemical signals from dead nestmates to coordinate hive activity. But that is purely mechanical. What Vasquez did was another spike of white, chosen. Yora looked out at the planet. Somewhere down there, in a pressurized hab unit, Miguel Vasquez was probably still working. 26 years old. Talked too fast and laughed at his own jokes before he finished them and had attached himself to Fenwick the way young researchers attach themselves to scientists who make them feel like the work matters. She had received his formal acknowledgement of the death notification. His reply had consisted of 4 words, I'll finish her samples. She had thought, at the time, that it was shock. Displacement activity. The kind of thing people do when they don't know how to stop moving. Maybe it was. Maybe that was the point. What does your model predict now? She asked. Stillwater was quiet for a long time. The colors moved through something complex and unclassifiable. That is why I requested this session, it finally said. Our model does not predict now. For the first time in 60,000 years of continuous observation, Commander, We have encountered a data set that our model cannot process. Your species should have broken. The mathematics are clear. You have experienced sufficient loss, individually, historically, collectively, that any other species would have calcified or fragmented by now. The color settled into something that might have been wonder, or might have been fear, or might, Yora was beginning to understand, have been both at once. Instead you do something that has no name in our language. You grieve and you continue. You let the dead remain present. You finish the work. A pause. We need to understand why. We believe it may be the most important question we have ever asked. Yora turned from the viewport. Then you'd better talk to Vasquez, she said. Miguel Vasquez had not slept in 31 hours when Stillwater arrived at the laboratory threshold. Yora had warned him. She'd sent a message the night before, the Vethara ambassador wants to speak with you, your choice, no pressure, and he had replied with okay and then apparently gone back to cataloguing spore samples as though the universe had not just asked him to explain human grief to a 60,000-year-old alien civilization. When Yora arrived to make the introduction, she found him exactly where she'd expected, hunched over a specimen tray, his dark hair unwashed. 3 empty coffee bulbs floating near the recycler where he'd missed the return slot. He looked up when they entered. His eyes were still red at the edges. "Ambassador," he said. "Not nervous, exactly. Just very tired, in the way that goes bone deep and stops feeling like tiredness and starts feeling like weather." Stillwater moved into the laboratory with the careful slowness it used in confined spaces, its form compressing slightly to avoid the hanging equipment. Its colors ran a query shade that Yora had learned to recognize as genuine attention. "You completed her work," Stillwater said. Vasquez looked at the specimen trays. "Yeah." "Why?" The question landed in the room with the flat weight Vethara questions always had, no softening, no social scaffolding, just the thing itself. Vasquez didn't flinch. He picked up a sample container and turned it in his hands, the label facing outward. Yora could read it from where she stood, Fenwick's reach. Spore Cluster 7, Northern Shelf. Collected T. Fenwick, completed M. Vasquez. "Because she found them," he said. "She was out there for 9 hours in a suit that kept throwing thermal warnings, and she found them, and she thought they were important. She told me the night before." He stopped. Cleared his throat. "She said she thought the spore distribution pattern was non-random. That something was arranging them, or had been, a long time ago. She was excited about it. She does this thing when she's excited where she talks really fast and forgets to eat." He corrected himself quietly, almost inaudibly. "Did." Stillwater's colors shifted. "The data she collected," it said. "It has value regardless of who collected it." "Yeah." "Then another researcher could have completed the cataloging." "Yeah." Vasquez set the container down carefully. "But they didn't find it." "She did. She was cold and the suit was malfunctioning and she thought it was important enough to stay out there anyway, and she was right, and she deserves to be the one who found it." He looked up at Stillwater with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who had run out of energy to be anything other than honest. "If I leave her samples unfinished, it's like she went out there for nothing. I can't." He paused, searching. "I can't let that be what happened. Do you understand?" Stillwater was silent for 11 seconds. Yora counted. "No," it said finally. "But I would like to." The sessions ran for 3 weeks. Stillwater came to the laboratory every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 6. It brought other Vethara, observers who hung at the edges of rooms and cycled through colors Yora's translation matrix struggled with. The diplomatic corps started calling them the audience, which the Vethara did not object to because they did not yet have a word for self-consciousness. Vasquez talked. Yora hadn't expected that. She'd anticipated someone who would give careful, diplomatic answers, who would feel the weight of representing humanity to an alien observer and perform accordingly. Instead, he just talked, the way he apparently talked about everything, fast and sideways and circling back, losing the thread and finding it again. He talked about Fenwick's laugh. He talked about the argument she'd had with Petrov, which had been about sample contamination protocols and had gotten loud enough that 3 people had quietly left the room, and how 2 days later they'd been eating lunch together like it had never happened because Fenwick believed very strongly that you could be furious with someone and still find them worth knowing. He talked about his grandmother, who had died when he was 12, and how he still heard her voice sometimes when he was doing something she'd taught him, cooking, or measuring, or the specific way she'd held a tool, and how that wasn't frightening, it was good, it was like she'd left instructions. Instructions, Stillwater repeated. Yeah. Like, people leave things in you. Ways of seeing. Habits. My grandmother taught me that if a measurement feels wrong, you measure again, even if the numbers say you're right. I still do that. I'll do it until I die, and if I ever teach anyone, they'll do it too, and she'll be in that. He frowned at a sample tray. I don't know if that makes sense. It does not, Stillwater said, in the tone Yora had come to recognize as please continue. She's gone, but she's not finished. She keeps going. Through me, and through everyone she ever changed. Vasquez looked up. Same with Fenwick. Her work is here. Her name's on these samples. Anyone who ever reads this catalogue will know she was cold and scared and thought this was important enough anyway. That's not nothing. That's, she continues. Stillwater's colors ran something long and complex. In our species, it said slowly, when an individual dies, their contribution is recorded. Documented. The record is maintained for the benefit of subsequent researchers. This is what you describe, is it not? Not exactly. Vasquez chewed his lip. A record is just information. What I'm talking about is more like, she's still here. Present. She has a claim on what happens next. When I finished her catalogue, I wasn't just preserving data. I was being accountable to her. Like she could still want things. Have preferences. Like finishing her work matters to her, even now. She is dead, Stillwater said. Not cruelly. Just precisely. Yeah. Vasquez didn't look away. She's still here. On the 14th day, one of the Vethara observers, the one the crew had started calling Deepwater, because its baseline color ran darker than the others, requested to speak directly with Petrov. Yora delivered the request personally. Petrov was in the engineering bay, doing something complicated to a coolant relay with the focused expression he wore when he wanted people to think he hadn't noticed them. The aliens want to ask me about the break room, he said, before she spoke. How did you know? Vasquez told me they've been asking him about, he waved a hand, why we do the things we do when someone dies. The gathering. The stories. He set down his tool. He was a big man, Petrov, broad through the shoulders, with a grey beard he kept meaning to shave. He looked, Yora thought, like someone who had spent his whole life being the person other people leaned on and was so practiced at it that he'd forgotten it was a choice. I heard him telling them about the break room. About what I did. Is that all right? Petrov was quiet for a moment. Fenwick called me a bureaucratic fossil to my face on at least 4 separate occasions, he said. She once submitted a formal protest because I flagged her sample collection methodology as insufficiently documented, and the protest was 6 pages long and included a bibliography. 6 pages. Something moved through his expression, complicated and brief. I didn't agree with how she worked. I thought she cut corners. I thought she was going to get herself hurt because she cared more about the finding than the protocol. He picked up his tool again. I was right, and I would give quite a lot to have been wrong. Yora said nothing. Yes, he said. Tell the ambassador I'll speak with them. The session with Petrov lasted for hours. Yora wasn't present, but she reviewed the translation logs afterward. Deepwater had asked him, with characteristic Vethara directness, why he had comforted the young researcher given that he had disagreed with Dr. Fenwick's methods and had no strong prior relationship with Vasquez. Petrov's answer, as rendered by the translation matrix, took up 3 paragraphs. But the core of it was simple. He was drowning. I know what that looks like. You don't let someone drown because you had an argument with someone else. Deepwater's follow-up question was the one that kept Yora awake that night. But it cost you time, energy, emotional exposure. You take on the grief of others voluntarily, when withdrawal would be less costly. When your species experiences loss, you move toward each other rather than away. Why? What does it return to you? Petrov had apparently sat with this for a long time before answering. We don't do it for return. That's not what it is. A pause. When I held that kid in the break room, I was also holding myself. Everyone I've lost. Everyone who ever sat with me when I couldn't keep the weight of something alone. It goes in both directions at once. Backward and forward. When I help someone carry something, I'm also being helped by everyone who ever helped me, and I'm becoming someone who will be remembered as the kind of person who helps. Another pause. After I'm gone, that continues. Vasquez will know that you sit with people. He'll do it for someone else someday. The being helped goes forward. You are describing inheritance, Deepwater had said. I'm describing love, Petrov had said. But yes. Same thing, maybe. Yora read this exchange at 0200 station time, alone in her office, with the planet turning slowly in the viewport and the ship breathing quietly around her. She read it twice. Then she looked out at the dark and thought about everyone she'd carried and everyone who'd carried her, all the way back, an unbroken chain of people holding other people up across centuries, and she understood, or began to understand, why Stillwater had said its models had failed. They had built their mathematics around loss as subtraction. Something taken. A wound that either scarred over or didn't. They had never considered that a species might have found a way to make loss additive. She was still thinking about this when her comm chimed. Stillwater. Requesting an emergency session. She closed the translation logs. I'm on my way, she said. Stillwater was not alone when Yora arrived. The diplomatic bay held 7 Vethara, which was 6 more than protocol allowed for a bilateral session. They were arranged in a loose configuration that Yora's instincts read as a council formation, though she had never seen the Vethara use one before. Their colors were synchronized in a way she hadn't witnessed, cycling together through a deep amber that shaded into violet at its peak, then back, like breathing. The translation matrix flagged the collective pattern as unprecedented input, attempting analysis. She stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room the way she'd learned to read rooms in 22 years of command. Something had shifted. Not threat. The Vethara didn't do threat the way humans did, didn't have the right body language for it. This was something else. The closest human analog she could find was the feeling in a room just after a decision has been made that everyone knows is irreversible. Commander Osei. Stillwater separated from the group and moved toward her. Its colors were doing something she'd never seen, the amber-violet cycle layering over a second pattern running underneath, a slow silver pulse that the Matrix tentatively flagged as significance being assigned. Thank you for coming. You said emergency. We have been discussing whether this qualifies. Stillwater paused. We concluded that by your species' definition, it does. By ours, we do not have a category for what this is. Yora walked to the table and Saturday. Stillwater arranged itself across from her. The other 6 held their positions, and she understood that they were not going to be introduced and she was not going to ask. Tell me, she said. We have been in contact with the Vethara Continuance, Stillwater said. The governing body. It meets infrequently. The last full convening was 212 years ago. It convened last night because of the data from this vessel. Yora kept her face still. The data from Vasquez and Petrov. And others. We have been watching your entire crew, Commander. Every Grieve event, large and small, over the 11 years of contact. A researcher losing a parent on Earth. A pilot who received news of a miscarriage via delayed transmission and reported for duty the following morning and flew perfectly and cried in the debriefing. A navigation officer who keeps a photograph of a dead friend clipped to his workstation and speaks to it sometimes when he believes he is alone. Stillwater's colors held steady in a way that felt deliberate. We have been cataloging what we did not understand. Last night we presented it to the Continuance, and the Continuance made a determination. Which was? That we have been wrong. The colors spiked, silver and white, the Matrix working hard. For 60,000 years, Commander, we have operated under a model of civilizational stability that treats grief as a variable to be managed. A cost. Successful civilizations, we believed, were the ones that developed effective mechanisms to limit grief's damage through reduced attachment, distributed emotional risk, rapid processing, and forward movement. The civilizations that could not manage the cost of loss collapsed under its weight. A pause. We have watched 31 civilizations collapse. We were confident in the model. But it didn't predict us. It predicted you would collapse within 2 generations of interstellar contact. You have not. You are, by several measurable metrics, more cohesive than when contact began. Your crew has experienced 11 major loss events in 11 years, and each one has, the colors did something complicated, each one has made you more connected, more willing to risk, more capable. Stillwater moved slightly, adrift toward the viewport that Yora was starting to read as contemplative movement. The Continuance reviewed the data and reached a conclusion that none of us expected. Yora waited. You are not managing grief, Stillwater said. You are metabolizing it. Transforming it into something that does not exist in our models. The dead remain present in your networks, not as records, not as data, but as active relational forces. Petrov holds Vasquez. Vasquez finishes Fenwick's work. Fenwick's name goes on the catalogue. Everyone who reads the catalogue is changed by her, will be changed by her, for as long as the work continues. The silver pulse deepened. You have built a system in which the dead continue to contribute, in which loss accumulates not as damage but as the continuance spent for hours on the translation and settled on depth. You become deeper, more capable of bearing weight, the more weight you have borne. The room was very quiet. We believe, Stillwater continued, that this is why you did not collapse. Every other civilization we have observed treats loss as something to be survived. You treat it as something to be integrated. You incorporate the dead into the living network and the network becomes stronger, not weaker. It is a form of civilizational architecture we have never encountered. The Continuance believes it may be the reason you are here, talking to us, when so many others are not. Yora looked at the planet in the viewport. She thought about the photograph clipped to a workstation. She thought about a 6-page protest with a bibliography. She thought about her mother's hands teaching her to braid, a specific movement she still made sometimes without thinking, her mother reaching forward through 20 years of absence to touch her daughter's hair. What does the Continuance want to do with this determination? She asked. That is why I called this session. Stillwater turned from the viewport. The Continuance wishes to propose an amendment to the contact agreement. A new phase of exchange. The colors steadied. Commander, we would like to learn from you. The negotiation took 8 days. Not because it was contentious, the Vethara didn't negotiate the way humans did, with positional maneuvering and strategic concession. They deliberated. They brought in observers from 4 other vessels. They sent queries to the Continuance and waited for responses that sometimes took 18 hours and arrived in formats that required 2 linguists working in tandem to interpret. What they were asking for, Yora came to understand, was not a technology transfer. Not tactical information or biological data or any of the things Earth's strategic planners had spent decades quietly worrying the Vethara might eventually want. They were asking for something that had no precedent in 60,000 years of contact history. They wanted to be taught how to grieve. Specifically, how to let the dead remain present. How to carry loss as weight that strengthened rather than crushed. They had lost individuals across their long history, and they had managed those losses efficiently, and Stillwater told her, quietly, near the end of the 6th day, that the Continuance believed this efficiency was why several of their own colony civilizations had eventually gone quiet and still and stopped. Not collapsed dramatically. Just thinned out. Became less. Until one day the signals stopped coming and the Vethara sent ships and found infrastructure intact and populations alive and everything simply running at a lower and lower frequency, like a song slowing down. And no one could say exactly when it had stopped being music. You grieve your lost colonies, Yora said. We record them, Stillwater said. We did not know there was a difference until now. On the 7th day, Vasquez asked to be present for the formal agreement signing. He came in with unwashed hair and a coffee bulb and the sample container with Fenwick's name on it, which he set on the table without explanation. Nobody asked him to move it. The agreement was straightforward in the end. A new joint research program. Human crew members would work with Vethara observers, not as subjects, but as collaborators. They would share what they knew of mourning rituals, of memorial practice, of the specific human technology of keeping the dead alive in the living. And the Vethara would share what 60,000 years of civilizational observation had taught them about the patterns and the failures and the quiet endings, so that humanity could understand what it had, apparently, accidentally gotten right. Stillwater signed, or performed the Vethara equivalent, a color change of specific duration that the agreement recognized as binding, and then sat still for a moment. There is one more thing, it said. A question from the Continuance. Personal, not diplomatic. You may decline to answer. Yora nodded. Stillwater's colors moved into the amber-violet configuration she now recognized as its most careful register, the one it used when it was handling something fragile. The Continuance wishes to know, when you carry the dead, when you hold them present in your networks and continue their work and speak their names, does it hurt? The room was very quiet. Vasquez answered before Yora could. He wasn't looking at Stillwater. He was looking at the sample container with Fenwick's name on it. Yeah, he said. Constantly. Stillwater waited. That's not a reason to put them down, Vasquez said. You don't put someone down because they're heavy. That's not. He stopped, found it again. The weight is the point. The weight is how you know it was real. How you know they mattered. He looked up. If I put her down, she didn't matter. I'm not going to do that. Stillwater was silent for a long time. Its color cycled through something vast and slow that the translation matrix rendered, with unusual confidence, as grief. Perhaps it had found the word at last. Perhaps the learning had already begun. Yora looked around the room, at Vasquez with his coffee and his unwashed hair and the name of his dead mentor written in his own handwriting on a sample container, at the 7 Vethara holding their synchronized colors, at the planet turning in the viewport below, indifferent as ever, as planets always were. She thought of Petrov in the break room. The navigation officer's photograph. Her mother's hands. The chain of it, unbroken. All the way back to the first human who ever sat with another human in the dark and decided that the weight was worth carrying. They had not built starships first. They had not built weapons first, or cities, or mathematics. Long before any of that, they had built this, the stubborn, irrational, irreplaceable practice of refusing to let each other go. 60,000 years of observation, and the Vethara had only just found it. Yora hoped they would find it in time. She suspected, for the first time in a long time, with something that felt almost like certainty, that they would. The joint research program was given a name in both languages. In Vethara, it was a color sequence that translated roughly as the study of weight that does not crush. In the agreement documents, the human side listed it simply as the Fenwick program, and nobody voted on this or debated it. Vasquez had written it on the cover page of the first proposal document and Yora had signed beneath it, and that was that. Some things don't require committees. The first formal session took place 11 days after the agreement signing, in a shared workspace that the engineering crew had converted from a secondary storage bay. They'd done it without being asked. Petrov had apparently mentioned offhandedly that the diplomatic bay felt too formal for what this needed to be, and by the next morning someone had moved furniture and someone else had brought plants from the botany module, small green things in magnetic pots that stuck to the walls, and a third person had hung a photograph. It was Fenwick. Someone had printed it from the crew archive, a candid, not an official portrait. She was in this very bay, actually, back when it was still storage, laughing at something off-camera with her head thrown back and a sample case half open in her hands, caught mid-sentence about something that had clearly delighted her. Nobody admitted to hanging it. Nobody took it down. Stillwater arrived for the first session and stopped in the doorway for a long time. Its colors moved through something slow and unclassifiable. Then it moved to the center of the room and arranged itself, and the work began. What followed was not what Yora had expected. She had anticipated something structured. Academic. A formal exchange, human researchers presenting documented morning practices, Vethara observers recording and analyzing. She had prepared talking points. She had asked the ship's counselor, Dr. Reyes, to develop a curriculum framework. What actually happened was that Stillwater looked at the photograph of Fenwick and asked Vasquez to tell it something true about her that wasn't in any official record. Vasquez looked startled. Then he looked at the photograph for a moment. She couldn't whistle, he said. She kept trying. She'd heard somewhere that you could train yourself to whistle any tune if you practiced enough, so she'd practice in the lab while she was working, just this tuneless, he demonstrated briefly, a formless breath of air, for months. She never got better. She refused to accept that some people just can't whistle. She thought it was a solvable problem. He stopped. I haven't thought about that in weeks. I'd forgotten. And now? Now I remembered. He paused. Now it's back. Stillwater's colors moved. It was not lost. It was stored in you. Yeah. And by telling it to me, now it's stored in you too. Vasquez looked at the alien with something complicated in his expression. That's how it works. You keep saying it. You keep telling it. Every time you tell it to someone who didn't know her, she gets a little bigger than the space she left. She spreads out. He turned back to the photograph. Eventually enough people are carrying enough of her that she's not really gone. She's distributed. She's in the network. Stillwater was quiet for a long time. This is why you tell stories at the gathering after death, it said. We observed this in your species and classified it as social bonding behavior around shared loss. Stress response. Mutual regulation. It's that too. But it is also architecture. You are building a structure. A place for the dead to continue existing inside the living. The colors shifted. We have records. We have documentation. But a record does not carry anything. It contains information. The information does not want anything. It does not have weight. A pause. When Petrov held Vasquez in the break room, he was not exchanging information. He was letting some of what he was carrying go into someone else, Vasquez said quietly. And taking some of what Petrov was carrying. You share the weight. That's why you move toward each other. You can't carry it alone, so you distribute it, and distributed weight is bearable weight. Stillwater's colors ran the silver pulse that Yora had come to associate with something being learned rather than merely recorded. We move away, it said. When one of us is lost. We process individually. We consider collective processing, proximity during grief, to be a contamination risk. Emotional interference. It is interference, Vasquez said. That's the whole point. You're supposed to interfere with each other. You're supposed to get inside each other's grief and mix it up with your own until you can't tell whose is whose anymore, because then it's shared and shared things are survivable. He picked up his coffee. You've been protecting yourselves from the thing that would have saved your colonies. The room was very still. Stillwater's colors held at the silver for a long moment. Then, slowly, they shifted into something new, something Yora had never seen, and the translation matrix had never seen, and would spend the next 3 days attempting to categorize before settling on a phrase that satisfied nobody but was the closest available approximation, the willingness to be changed by what is lost. Perhaps that was grief, in the end. Perhaps that was what the word had always meant and what the Vethara had never had a name for because they had never allowed it to happen to them. Petrov joined the sessions on the 4th day. He came in with coffee for himself and sat in the back and didn't say much at first, just listened, which was not something people generally associated with Petrov. But Yora had started to understand that this was how he'd always worked. He listened until he had something exact to say, and then he said it with the precision of someone who had learned that words, deployed carefully, could hold weight that arms could not. On the 6th day, one of the Vethara observers, Deepwater, who had been present at every session, asked him a question directly. "You said love and inheritance were the same thing," it said. "We have been considering this. We do not have inheritance in the sense you mean. We have information transfer, skill transfer. But you describe something that passes between individuals without their awareness. Something that changes the shape of a person without their choosing." Petrov considered this for a moment. "My father," he said, "was a difficult man. Stubborn. Not always kind. He died when I was 19 and I spent a long time being angry at him for things I couldn't forgive. He turned his coffee in his hands. I'm 53 now. I look back and I see him in everything I do. The good things and the bad things and the things I had to fight to become instead of what he was. He shaped me. Even where I pushed against him, especially there. I am partly the shape of my resistance to him." Deepwater's colors moved. "You carry someone who hurt you. I carry who I became because of him. Which includes the parts that hurt and the parts one built against the hurt." Petrov looked up. "You don't get to choose who shapes you. You only choose what you do with the shape." A pause. "He also taught me to measure twice. Told me you could be furious with someone and still learn from them. Might have been the most useful thing anyone ever told me." Something moved through his expression, brief and complicated. "I told it to Fenwick once, during an argument. She threw it back at me 9 days later like she'd invented it." The room did something then, a sound that started with Vasquez and moved around the human side of the table and even touched Reyes and 2 of the junior researchers, a sound that was partly grief and partly something brighter, and Yora recognized it as the thing Stillwater had first described and not understood, the simultaneous laugh and cry, the impossible coexistence of loss and warmth. The Vethara observers were very still. Their colors were synchronized, running slow and attentive, the pattern of genuine attention that Yora now knew was the closest they came to leaning forward and learning. Watching the humans do the impossible thing. The thing that had no name in 60,000 years of language until 3 weeks ago and now had one, tentatively, provisionally, a word borrowed from the data of a break room and a sample catalogue and a photograph hung on a wall by someone who hadn't signed their name. On the last day of the first formal session block, Stillwater asked to make a statement. It stood, arranged itself, drifted into a position that Yora had learned to read as formal, and its colors settled into a deep, slow amber that the matrix rendered as considered declaration. The Continuance has reviewed 3 weeks of session data, it said. It has also reviewed the full 11-year contact record, reanalyzed through the new framework. It wishes me to convey the following. The room was quiet. Of the 31 civilizations we have watched collapse or diminish, we have identified, in retrospect, the moment in each case when the thinning began. It was not war. It was not resource failure. It was not conflict or disease or any of the causes we had previously weighted most heavily. The amber deepened. In every case, the signal precedes the collapse by generations. And the signal is this: the species stops saying the names of the dead. Nobody moved. They stopped telling the stories. They stopped finishing the work. The dead become records, information, not presence, and the living become lighter, and the lightness feels like relief, but it is actually, the colors spike briefly into white, it is actually the weight leaving. The depth leaving. And without depth, a civilization can survive, but it cannot hold. It cannot bear the weight of its own ambition or its own suffering, and so it reduces itself to what it can manage, and then reduces again, and then again, until there is very little left to reduce. Stillwater paused. The Continuance believes this is what happened to our colonies. They became efficient. They managed their grief well and their attachment carefully, and they protected themselves from the cost of loss, and they thinned out and went quiet, and we sent ships and found them alive and empty. Another pause. We recorded their names. We did not carry them. We did not know there was a difference. Vasquez had both hands wrapped around his coffee. His eyes were bright. We know now, Stillwater said. Because of this vessel. Because of this crew. Because a young researcher finished the work of his dead mentor and an older man held him in a break room, and neither of them could explain why except that it was necessary. The Continuance wishes me to say, the colors held, steady and deep, that your species has done something we did not believe was possible. You have found a way to make loss into legacy. To make death additive. To carry the dead not as burden but as ballast, the weight that keeps a ship from capsizing in rough water. The room was very still. We would like to learn. We understand this will take a long time. We understand it cannot be transferred as data or documented as protocol. We understand that it lives in the telling, in the sitting beside, in the finishing of work left undone. Stillwater's color settled into something Yara had never seen from a Vethara, something open, she thought. Something that had lowered a protection. We are asking to be taught as students, not as observers. To be inside the grief, not outside it. To allow your losses to interfere with us and our losses to interfere with you, until we cannot tell whose weight is whose. Vasquez was the first to speak. That's going to hurt, he said. Yes, Stillwater said. We are beginning to understand that this is not a reason to refuse. Yara looked at Stillwater, at the open, lowered colors, at the 6 observers behind it cycling slow and attentive, at the photograph of Fenwick on the wall, laughing at something off camera, mid-sentence, always mid-sentence, and she felt the chain of it again. The long unbroken chain running back through every human who had ever sat in the dark with someone else and decided the weight was worth sharing. Running forward now, through Vasquez and Petrov and every name on every sample container, forward into whatever came next, past the edge of anything she could see. She thought of Fenwick in the spore field. Cold suit, thermal warnings, something she thought was important enough to stay for. She had been right. Then we start tomorrow, Yara said. And we say her name first.